Okay, right, we're going to get started because it is 2 p.m. So let me just organise that. Right, kia ora koutou. Welcome to the third Sustainability Trust webinar for pretty much sustainability growing in your backyard. My name is Susie Robertson and I'm the Community Manager at Sustainability Trust. Today's webinar is the third of a 4-part series, and today is all about composting at home, and I'm joined by 3 amazing ladies who I will introduce shortly. These webinars are co-hosted by KaiCycle and GrowSpace. I'm going to start this hui off with a karakia or a blessing, and then I will talk you through how the webinar works and how you can engage with us. So I will start off with whakatake hau. Whakatake hau ki te uru, whakatake hau ki te tonga, kia mākina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hiaki ana te atakura he tio he hoka he ohu, tihei mauri ora. So hopefully you've noticed now that you're all on mute. That's not because we don't want to hear from you, because we do. That's what this is all about. It's a Q&A session. So what you need to do is find the little Q&A button somewhere on your screen. It could be at the top, it could be at the bottom, it could be at the side. And then what you do is you get on there and you start asking some questions. And what I'll do is hand them over to one of our panelists to answer. Usually what happens in these is that more than one person has an answer, and it might be slightly different. So you'll probably get to hear from 2 people, if not 3. So please start using that. We have got a couple of questions that were submitted via Facebook prior to today, so we'll probably kick off with some of those. But yeah, love to hear your questions. This is being recorded and will be available at the Sustainability Trust website afterwards, along with a corresponding blog post and lots of useful links. So head to Sustainability Trust after this or send your friends there if they can't be here at this exact moment, but they can tune in at a later time. I guess this is a difficult time for some of us, and now more than ever, food resilience and dealing with our own waste has become more and more important. So it's great that we're having this session today on composting, so that we can become more self-sufficient and deal with our own food waste, not only individually but as a community. Perfect timing, I feel. So I will, without further ado, introduce our panellists who will hand over to each other, and I'm going to start with Kate. Over to you.
Cool. Kia ora koutou. I'm Kate. I am from Waneke, Wellington. I'm part of the KaiCycle project, which is an urban farming and composting initiative based in Newtown. It's one of our kind of outer central suburbs. So we're on Hospital Road, and that's where we have a small farm, about 500 metres of beds that we grow food off, and we have a composting hub, and we offer a composting service to local households and businesses. We ride around on e-bikes a couple times a week and pick up people's food scraps, take that back to our farm in Newtown, compost it, and we use that compost to feed our garden beds and grow our kai. So we're trying to build this local food loop where local food waste is transformed back into local food, and we'd love to see our cities becoming our new food bowls. So seeing us producing a lot more of produce that we eat within our cities and turning all that food waste into soil so we can grow food, not landfills. So that's what we're about. We're also about educating people about the importance of composting and soil health and good, healthy, nutrient-dense food. So that's what we're looking to do more of this year. So thanks for having us on this webinar. It's really great to be able to keep on interacting with our community, even in this lockdown kind of period. So handing over to the awesome Jess to introduce.
Cool. Thanks so much, Kate. Kia ora koutou. So my name is Jess. I'm in Purua. I have a business called Sunshine in a Bottle Composting, where I do residential kitchen scrap pickup in my kind of area, and then I take it to a farm that I also manage and do it. I have a partnership with For the Better Good, so I compost in really big bins there. And then I also do compost coaching, and then kind of ongoing support for households to really get their composting on point. And that's very, very fun to see the enthusiasm of households and what they want to be able to do. So what I'm really about is just empowering people to kind of take a local waste and turn it into a local resource, because it's a resource that we're kind of throwing into the landfill. And I always get really excited when people get really excited about composting, and it's really adorable and I love it. So yeah, that's me. I'm going to pass it on to Prashanti.
Thanks, Jess. Kia ora koutou. I'm Prashanti Lovegrove, and just a little bit about myself. I'm trained in sustainable horticulture, native ecology and conservation, and more recently, education. I'm really passionate about the health of Papatūānuku and living light on the earth. I've been on Waiheke Island for almost 15 years, and I manage my own property where I grow fruit trees and vegetables and compost, of course. I've been managing a project called Compost Co. under the Waiheke Resources Trust for over a year. And this is a small business operation where we collect food waste from local restaurants and compostable packaging as well, such as coffee cups and products from our local markets and zero waste events. We process this through 12 compost bins, and we divert about 20 tonnes of food waste from landfill every year, and of course my goal is to eradicate all food waste going to landfill. So from an educational aspect, I manage a different contract under the Auckland Council called Compost Collective, and that's all about educating our community to compost their food scraps at home. So that's me.
Awesome. I think hopefully if you're watching, you can agree that we have some pretty good people here ready to answer your questions. So I'm going to kick off with one of the questions that came in from Councillor Jill Day, I believe, which is what can you put in your compost and what can't you put in your compost, understanding that there are different ways of composting, but we're mainly focusing on the ways people compost at home. So I'm going to hand that one over to Prashanti to start us off.
Yeah, so lots of people have different ideas about what you can and cannot put in your compost bin. I think my response would be everything can go in your compost bin. Everything that's organic can turn back into compost. So your hair from your hairbrush, it can go in the compost bin. There's a bit of controversy about meat, whether that can go in your compost bin, and I thought maybe shall I talk a little bit about that? My thoughts about meat going in the compost bin is that if you practice bokashi composting, then that would be a really good time to put your meat in your bokashi first of all. Of course, the bones won't decompose. And another thing about meat is that it attracts rodents potentially, but all food scraps attract rodents. So it's just important to make sure that your compost bin is rodent proof. The other thing that meat can do is it can create a smell as well. So that's something just to consider if you're smell adverse. But otherwise, I would say everything can go in your compost bin.
Great. Anyone else want to add to that?
Just a note on compostable packaging. That can be sometimes tricky to break down in a home bin that tend to be a bit smaller and don't get as hot. In our really big bins at the farm, we're getting up to 65, 70 degrees, and that's going to break down some of that PLA type plastic. But in your home bin, it's probably just not getting hot enough, and you'll just find it cycling through repeatedly. And I think we're still learning about what it means to have compostable packaging and what that actually breaks down to.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I think if you're going to be putting stuff in your home compost bin, those home systems don't get very hot, so things break down a lot more slowly. Just chopping things up first really helps anything break down. So like big cabbage leaves or broccoli stalks or big bits of cardboard or packaging, just cutting it up is a lot better, or soaking it if it's cardboard or paper packaging. While recycling is kind of in dire straits at the moment during COVID, your compost is a really good place for your paper and cardboard recycling. Most inks, most stuff that's printed on a large scale is actually veggie-based inks now, so it's fine to put in. But as always, like if you're not sure, probably best to leave it out because it's going to go into your soil. And I guess with bones, and shells. I mean, probably if you can, I mean, it's always best to reduce what you, to make the most of your food to start with. So you don't have, you're composting, you're still composting whatever comes out, but you're making the most of the food that you can eat. So with bones, meat scraps, can you turn it into stock? Could you freeze it and turn it into some other kind of meal? And then you could also look into doing bone char with a stash of bones, which is a really cool thing to add to your garden. But I won't go into that into too much depth now.
Right, and maybe another reason to become vegetarian. You don't have to deal with the buns.
Exactly.
That's not what this is about today, though. So yeah, I'm just gonna, maybe I'll put this one at you, Kate, because you talked about it. In terms of cardboard, do we need to be worried about the inks and the glue in cardboard?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something I could also learn more about, but we're pretty happy with putting smallish amounts of cardboard. I mean, you don't want to be making the best compost you can make with a diversity of ingredients. You don't want to have it too heavy in any one thing. We're pretty happy with putting cardboard and paper products in our compost as a carbon source. Cardboard does have quite a lot of boron in it with the glue, like borax, but from what I understand, most processors these days don't leave too much harmful residue in the paper, as in like bleach. Yeah, paper doesn't contain bleach anymore now that how it's processed, but that is something that I could definitely learn more about. But yeah, I think like glossy paper or glossy paper is not ideal to put in your compost bin. Perhaps it's worth checking, like newspaper's fine, but if you're printing, from your home printer, probably worth checking what ink that is before putting in your compost. But yeah, newspaper, bulk printer paper, probably fine as far as I know.
Awesome. Okay, I'm gonna, we've been asked a few questions about the ratios, the brown-green ratios. So Jessica, can I pass that one over to you?
I love talking about this. I don't know why, but I think it's fascinating. I think it's kind of, it's like a science experiment a little bit. So your kind of broad guidance is you want 3 parts carbon. So that's your dry things, your dried leaves, your newspaper, shredded newspaper, straw, kind of anything that takes a really long time to break down, to 1 part nitrogen. So that's your food scraps. But that will shift depending on what your carbon source is. So if you're doing something like dried grass that you've just mown your lawn and you let it all fully dried out, you have your carbon source now, you could probably put 3 buckets of that dried grass to your 1 bucket of food scraps, and that will work wonderfully. But if you're doing something like shredded newspaper, you're probably fine with 1 bucket of shredded newspaper to your 1 bucket of nitrogen source, just because that newspaper is much higher in carbon than that shredded grass, that dried grass. So it's take a 3-to-1 as your starting ratio, and then experiment. See what's happening in your compost. Make sure your moisture levels are good. And if nothing's happening, you go, okay, I need to add a bit more nitrogen to get it kind of kicking into high gear. Or if it's gone smelly as, you need to add a bit more carbon. So looking at your resources that you have in your own space, you can kind of figure out what you can use and then adjust as needed. I think, Kate, you could probably also speak to that, because you also use a lot of different carbon sources as well, eh?
Yeah, and I think I like what you're saying there, and that it's about experimentation. Like, I think that's the fun part of composting, is like it is just like an ongoing experiment, and no matter if it's bad or smelly, you can always troubleshoot it. You can alys bring it back to good health. So don't be afraid
always be
giving
fixed.
it a go. You can't blow it up. Yeah, and I think, in general, better to err on the side of adding too much carbons than too much nitrogen. If you add too much carbon, the worst thing it's going to do is that it's going to happen quite slowly. But if you don't have enough carbon, if you overshoot the kind of the food scraps or the damp, really rich stuff, that's when you kind of get to making sludgy, smelly stuff. So yeah, best to err on the side of too much carbon if in doubt. And just check in how it's going. Keeping those observations going is pretty key. At KaiCycle we use wood chips, which are really, really high in carbon, take a very long time to break down. We use something called cotton chaff, which actually isn't as high in carbon as we had once thought. It's actually more of a nitrogen, which is crazy, but it does do a good job at soaking up the excess moisture. That's kind of why we're looking towards really maximizing paper, and how we can look at taking this urban waste stream and making the most of it by composting it, because a lot of it doesn't get recycled anyway. So that's kind of, paper's a really good kind of carbon nitrogen ratio to balance out food waste in a urban compost situation. Leaves also great. Sawdust, if you can get a hand of untreated sawdust, that's like primo. Yeah.
Awesome. I'm going to pass this next one to you, Prashanti. This is from Keanu. I'm new to composting. How do I start?
Awesome. Well, can I just address the last question, just in regards to the carbon nitrogen, just to remember that everything has, even your apple core has carbon and nitrogen in it. So yeah, we're always, I find carbon products one of the hardest things to source. So I guess just keep in mind that Mother Nature knows what to do, even if we don't. So the number one thing to get started with composting is it starts in the kitchen. It starts with separating your food scraps. So find a container that works for you and your family in your kitchen. Me personally, I just have one of those standard 10-litre buckets on the floor of my kitchen, and I kick it round when it gets in my way. In the summer when the flies come, I put a lid on it, but in the winter I just have it lidless, and my family knows to just put anything organic into that bin, and when it's full I walk it down to my compost bin. So it starts with separating our food waste and seeing that it's a resource that should not be going into our general waste stream. And once we have our bucket of food waste, then we can consider, what am I going to do with it now? And there's lots of things we can do with it. The most easiest thing to do with it, of course, is to put it in a simple compost bin. You can buy them flat packed, and you know, they're really straightforward. They've got some air vents in them. Ideally, we dig them into the ground a little bit to prevent those rodents coming in, and just find something dry that you can put on top of it, something brown that we've just been talking about.
Awesome. We've got a very specific question about a bokashi bin from Adam. So Adam has bought a bokashi bin and is using it, but it's getting a bit stinky, so he's not sure if he's doing it right. Any tips there?
Yeah.
That so happened to me too. Go ahead, Shanti.
One thing just to start with is, don't be afraid of smells. You know, like smells don't mean that things are terrible. Yeah, so bokashi, if you read online about it, you'll read, oh, bokashi composting doesn't create a smell. Well, I would disagree with that. Bokashi creates its own smell, but it's a fermenting smell. It's not a putrid smell which makes you want to bath. So it's really a sweet, sort of alcoholic, yeasty kind of a smell, and it's something we should come to appreciate. Yeah, Jess, you can carry on.
Yeah, if checking the liquid levels, if there's too much liquid at the bottom, it depends on the bin. Some this isn't a problem, some this is. To make sure it's drained out the bottom and draining any of that excess liquid, and making sure you're pressing it down regularly enough, and like filling it regularly, fairly quickly. I had my very first customer that I did pick up from had her bokashi bins that had been out on her deck for 4 months, and at that point, like, they smell, they're like vomit inducing. They were awful, but that's just because they were left for too long and not drained. So if you drain your bin regularly enough, it has a distinct smell, but it's not horrendous. So check the moisture levels, and just kind of focus on filling it and then putting it aside and draining regularly.
Yeah, a few other things could be like to cut up your food a bit smaller to get in the bin, and to be putting it in regularly. So you don't want your food in your kitchen going all gross and moldy before you put it in your compost bin. When we're talking about bokashi, we're dealing with microorganisms, and they're beneficial microorganisms that are inoculated in that bokashi zing or brand product that you use. So if you have a moldy lemon, that's got its own microorganisms, mold kind of bad microorganisms that are inhibiting that moldy lemon. So when I do bokashi composting, I don't put moldy things into my bokashi bucket, because that will create like a competition between the good and bad microbes. And we really want the good microbes to win out when we're doing bokashi composting.
Awesome. Over to the topic of worms now. So slightly different, but there's two sort of related questions. So someone said, I've got a hungry bin. Can I make great worm castings in it? And if so, how? And then another person's just asked, where do they get worms, and what type of worms do I get from my compost? Should I hand that to you, Kate?
Yeah, sure. So I guess I've got most experience in aerobic composting, or like anaerobic composting, so microbial composting rather than worm composting. But yeah, I totally think that at the home scale, worm composting is like probably the dream for a small compost pile. Worms are really, really great composters. Yeah, so I've never used a hungry bin before, and yeah, you don't need to go and shell out for a hungry bin to make good worm castings. There's only other ways. I mean, yeah, there's so much research, kind of resources online on how to get a worm farm started. I find that in my home compost, you want to get tiger worms. They're like a red wrigglers. They're quite distinctive. They're quite bright red color, as opposed to your earthworms, which are more pink, and they're often quite little. I think the pregnant tiger worms are also yellow, or got like a yellow tinge, which is quite cool. Yeah, so I mean, tiger worms found their own way into my compost bin, but you can also, I've heard you can buy them from Bunnings. You could also ask, your neighbors, or there's a few Facebook groups online, or maybe Neighbourly. You could ask if anyone's already got some tiger worms that they're happy to part with. Obviously, worms will reproduce if they're happy, so you'll end up with quite a lot of worms if you're already established. But yeah, worm farming is great. An advantage of using worms at home to compost your food waste is that you don't need to turn it. The worms will move through the food waste and turn it up themselves. Once your food waste passes through a worm gut, that removes any pathogens. So that's it would see to anything in your compost, like meat or dairy or eggs, that could be a home for pathogens like disease-causing or organisms that could make us sick. So that's really great bonus of using worms at home. Anyone else got anything to add to that?
What was the question again?
So it's about using worms. Yeah, pretty much, where to get them and what kind of worms. And
Right. I think, so we had talked about meat at the beginning. I think the only thing with a worm farm is that you're not really wanting to be adding meat or dairy products, just because, like what Prashanti was saying, they just take so much longer to break down. And if you just have a little bin, they're just not going to break down quickly enough, and you'll end up with kind of maggots and things you don't really want in your worm bin if you have a smaller scale one. But otherwise, yeah, like Kate was saying, they're fantastic. Trade Me also, you can find worms on Trade Me. They're often kind of in your local neighborhood. Yeah.
Awesome. We actually have a hungry bin at Sustainability Trust, and the two things that we've found out is that they don't like too many coffee grinds. They get a little bit crazy. And we obviously don't like too much citrus. So yeah, we've learnt that to keep our worms happy, we can't just feed them on coffee. So
Susie, if you're starting a worm bin from scratch, just to keep in mind not to feed it too much too fast, that you really need to allow your worms to build up a population in order to be able to process more food. The other thing is also that worms don't always like to be in their kitchen gouging themselves with food. And if you think about what we like to do, we like to eat, but we also like to rest. So it's important to put a bit of shredded paper in there, or some sort of carbon product, so the worms can hang out. They really like to eat cardboard, but they like to just hang out and have a sleep in there as well. So don't only put food in your worm farm, or put something else that's paperish cardboard-like as well.
One product I really like in worm bins is coconut core. You can get it from like Bunnings or Mitre 10, and it comes in a solid block. It's like $3, and you get a massive amount. but it's a really good layer for the top of your worm bin, and it also helps to reduce fruit flies, because you'll be, as long as you're burying your food underneath that carbon source into kind of your soil, the incidence of fruit flies goes way down, which is really good.
Also, coffee sacks, worms really love. If you put a coffee sack as a lid on your worm farm, they'll come and they'll hang out and breed in there and eat it away too.
Great.
Can I add something there, Susie?
Sure.
I think people, so that if you're running your worm farm well, there shouldn't be actually heaps of excess moisture coming out at the bottom.
Yes.
You hear a lot of people talking about, oh, I've got bottles of worm wee for sale, but it's really, really nitrogen heavy. That it's more like leachate. So it's when you apply it to your garden, your plants might go straight away. They might go, whoa, and have a bit of a growth burst, but it's actually not the best thing for long-term soil health. So you shouldn't be putting excess water into your worm farm. You should be keeping a lid on it to make sure you don't have like rain or too much moisture going in. And any moisture that does come out the bottom, you could just put in on the top, is my understanding, kind of the best thing to do with that. When you do have finished worm poo, vermicast, that's when you can dilute it with some water and brew it up to make an awesome compost tea, and that's beautiful to apply to your plants.
Fantastic.
But when it's nice and mature.
Cool. This is the doozy. How do I know when my compost is ready? And just to add to that, this is from Janine. I just tried to use my compost with my soil for repotting plants, and now have lots of green shoots that were not the things I was planting. So two sort of great. How do I know when my compost's ready? And yeah, what would I do about that particular? And I'm gonna start with you, Jess.
Yeah, okay, so how do you know your compost ready? There's a few things that you can look at. So your first is looking at it. So do you see any pieces of uncomposted food? If it's looking fairly even and relatively consistent in texture and appearance, you're on your way there. Smell. So if you kind of pick up a little handful and it smells wonderful, like you're walking through an old growth forest, then you're on your way. And the third test is, if you really, really want to make sure, is doing something called a baggie test or a jar test. Is you can take your compost that you're pretty sure is done, put it into your jar or bag and seal it up, and then leave it for 12 hours, and then open it up and right away take a whiff. And if it's still smelling like that old growth forest, you're good. If it's smelling kind of rotten eggy, if it has that slightly ammonia smell, it's not quite done, and give it a little bit longer to continue finishing. You may still find that there's chunks of like big carbon sources, like if you had sticks in there or big pieces of wood chip, those do take longer to break down, and you can just chuck them back into another bin. But for the most part, it should be fairly even looking. And for most home bins are not going to get super, super hot. So you might find that seeds are still going to sprout. I had so many volunteer pumpkins this year in my garden because I put lots of compost in, and we ended up with like 24 pumpkins. Oh, thanks. Okay. So it's just that they didn't get hot enough, and some of those seeds survived and they sprout. That's okay. Just pull them out. Would anyone add anything to that?
Sounded awesome, Jess.
Just to say that not to be in a hurry with finishing your compost, and that in a home situation and you're using a compost bin, I would work on a 12-month time frame. When I do my commercial composting, it's more like a 4-month time frame, so we can pop out about 3 lots a year. But at home, it's just one compost bin a year, and as my compost bin fills up, it'll drop down again. And so even if you think your compost bin is full, don't forget about it, because when you go back next month, you'll see that you can actually put more food in.
And it'll be cool as well. Like, it shouldn't be warm anymore. If it's still quite warm, there's still a lot of stuff happening. It should be cool and consistently cool, even when you like stir it up or turn it. You
should also see plenty of life in that compost, like where it's all finish the process. You should, because the bacteria and the fungi and really drive that composting process. And then as the compost gets mature, you get larger organisms moving in, like insects and worms. So a handful of finished compost should have plenty of worms in it, should be absolutely teeming with life. And I think that's a big difference that we see between, you know, awesome compost that you can make at home or at a community scale, and compost that you buy kind of by the truckload that's been turned over with diggers, because a lot of that industrial process kind of is not conducive to having that awesome thriving life at the end stage. But compost is such a great thing to add to your garden because of that life that it puts into the system. So yeah, looking for lots of worms, lots of insects, that's really, really great.
Awesome. There's a very specific question. I think you were the one that talked about this, Kate, so I'm going to hand this to you. So Becky has asked, so coffee chaff I should be treating as nitrogen, question mark?
Right, yeah, cool. So I'm assuming, Becky, that you know, it sounds like you know what coffee chaff is, but just for anyone else, it's kind of looks like tiny cornflakes, tiny soft cornflakes that come off the outside of a bean when it's roasted, and you can get this at Saks or your local coffee roaster. So actually, shout out to Adam at Lafari, who sent away a sample to get tested because he knew that a lot of people were taking it to use in compost. So he wanted to give us a bit more information. Turns out that it's actually quite a lot lower in carbon than we thought. It's more of like I think it's more of a 25-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. If that sounds like mumbo jumbo, you're kind of going for the overall goal of 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. And that's in a molecular, sorry, I'm getting too deep here. But as Jess was saying, that could be anywhere between, in practical sense, anywhere between 1 to 3 buckets of brown stuff per bucket of green stuff. So chaff is more of it's kind of on the cusp, but it is dry, so it tends to act a bit more like a brown, and that it balances out the moisture of food waste really nicely. But you don't want to just be using chaff as your only carbon source. But for the home compost, it is really nice because it does soak up some of that extra moisture. Home compost often get quite wet. It is light, so it's easy to carry home. Just easy to have next to your compost to chuck in a few handfuls on top, which also keeps off flies. But yeah, you want to be adding more carbon heavy things in there as well, like dry leaves, dry grass clippings, straw, shredded cardboard or paper. So I hope that makes a little more sense. Kind of treat it in the middle. It's kind of, yeah.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to hand this one to you, Shanti. Weeds. What if I clear my garden out and I've got lots of weeds? Are there any particular weeds that I can't put in there? In fact, we had a question about this in terms of bamboo the other day, specifically.
Yeah, well, just like Jess was saying, our compost bins at home don't get hot enough to kill weed seeds. So what we're putting into our compost bin, it can potentially grow when it comes back out onto our garden. Up here in Auckland, it's been really dry over the summer, and what I'm finding was with some weeds like mint and other sort of weeds that might grow if you left them in your compost bin, well, at the moment, I'm able to leave them outside my bin and allow it really to dry and crisp up. So if you can dry out your weeds, not the seed part, but the propagating parts, and really let them go dry and crispy and potentially use them as a carbon product, then they won't necessarily grow again. I have dock as one of my main weeds in my vegetable garden at home. And to be honest, I just throw everything in. I know the dock's going to regrow if it comes back onto my garden, but because my garden's small and I don't make a lot of compost, we're working on a 1-year time frame, so I'm harvesting my compost maybe once a year to go on my garden. My garden's small enough for me to manage those weeds that are growing from my compost. So just keep on top of it. And you'll be all right. Just put everything in, is my opinion.
Nice, yeah. I mean, I think I've heard people say that putting like compost made with a lot of weeds is the best compost. I think just, yeah, as you say, just just bear in mind that what you're putting in might regrow. So I mean, personally, I would totally stay away from putting in fresh convolvulus or tradescantia. Those are something in Wellington that are real banes of existence, and some types of grass are quite noxious as well. But if you're not taking seed heads or roots of stuff that can easily propagate, then weeds are great. And if you're in doubt, then as Prashanti says, like drying them out, crisping them out first is a really great thing.
Or there's other go for it.
I was just going to say, environmental weeds. Yeah, it's a good point, Kate, to steer away from those environmental weeds like the ginger weed. Some people I know, they dig up the roots and they soak it in a bathtub, so you can really rot that weed down. The rhizome needs to be fully rotted before you can consider composting it. I would never put moth plant K-pods into my compost bin, not even my commercial compost. So those environmental weeds need to be thought about a bit more thoroughly.
And there's other uses for those weeds. So I like convolvulus, definitely never put in your compost, but you could take those weeds and soak them in water and make a weed tea. So you would strain out the weeds after you let them soak for, about a week, and use that water diluted about 1 to 20 as a fertilizer in your garden. Because like Kate was saying, that weeds are actually amazing plants. Like they pull up a lot of nutrients and can grow anywhere. Like that's actually kind of awesome, because they're tapping into something in the soil that sometimes our horticulture plants have a hard time doing. So if we can kind of take some of that goodness without potentially spreading those weeds by fermenting them, all the better.
Totally, Jess.
I think we've probably got time for 3 more questions. This one might be a quick answer by just one person, and then the other 2, I think we'll probably get a comment from everyone. What's the best alternative for the Bokashi Zing? Is there one? Who can answer that?
Yeah. If you check out the Waiheke Resources Trust Facebook page, I just posted a photo essay. It's a little 1-minute video about how to make your own lactobacillus serum. So if you don't have any Bokashi bran or Bokashi Zing, you can use it in a liquid. You can make your own liquid bran. It's a lactobacillus, which is basically rice, water and milk, putting them together and allowing that to ferment so that the curds come up to the top and the whey sits on the bottom, and the whey product is the lactobacillus. So you can then feed that whey product with sugar water and allow that to ferment, and then you can spray that as a liquid inoculant as opposed to the bran product. It's really straightforward and much more easy than it sounds. So yeah, check out that Facebook post I made.
Awesome.
Hey, could I jump really quickly?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just could you recommend what you do with your Bokashi once it's all nicely pickled and through that first stage, Prashanti?
Yeah, so Bokashi always needs to be buried. You can bury it in your garden straight away, or you can bury it in your compost bin. I find burying it in the garden, it needs to be buried quite deep, and even though online you might read it doesn't attract rodents, anecdotal evidence and my own experience shows that rodents will come and dig your garden if the Bokashi is quite shallow. So you could cover that with a weighted down cardboard or some old carpet or something like that. Otherwise, you can bury it in your compost bin. So what the benefits of putting it in your compost bin is that it will actually generate a little bit of heat in there. So it'll allow the compost to be processed and turned into compost a bit more quickly than if you didn't Bokashi your food waste and put it in your compost bin. But the number one thing to remember is always bury your Bokashi food waste.
Awesome. This is going to be our last question for today, and it's quite pertinent and follows on nicely from what you were just talking about. So how do I decrease heat loss in my compost over winter? I'm going to start with you, Prashanti.
Yeah, so to generate heat in a compost, you need a few things. Obviously, you need mass. So you need your compost bin to be big enough to be able to produce the heat that's required. The next thing is you actually do need quite a lot of nitrogen. And meat products, for example, they're teeming with bacteria. They're the ones that are going to heat up your compost. You need air in your compost to allow it to heat up. So it's the aerobic microorganisms that really generate the heat. But not to do that at the expense of the carbon, because of course carbon is essential additive to our compost. If there's not enough carbon, what will happen is very soon the air will disappear, and then you'll have a putrid or an anaerobic system that that won't be heating in the same way. So you need to have air, you need to have mass. So have sides that you can maybe put a lid on. The home compost bins, those flat pack ones we purchase, aren't really big enough to create that heat that we want. So if you make compost bins out of pellets, you know, like a 1 meter square is probably a minimum if you're trying to create a hot compost, and then really get the volumes in. So filling your compost bin up as fast as you can to allow that heat to generate.
Something also that I've heard, which is kind of, I guess, next level, but you could do is make a bit of a clay slurry. So like, I don't know, get some dry grass or weeds, and get some clay, put a bit of water on it, and you can actually paste the outside of it with clay, and that will help keep a bit of heat in. But yeah, like if you can make a freestanding pile, as Prashanti was saying, like that's a meter square or meter cubed, and that's the point at which you start getting the heat, because the composting is driven entirely by the organisms that are inside it. If you don't have, and the organisms are the one that are creating the heat. It's like, imagine a number of people in a hall, like the hall's not going to get hot unless there are like heaps of people in there. And that's the same as with compost, really.
And that's not an appropriate thing to be doing at the moment, standing in a hallway.
Your compost pile doesn't need to socially distance inside
unless they're all in your bubble. Okay, guys, we're going to have to wrap it up there, I'm afraid, because it is 2:40. Time flies when you're talking about compost. Just to firstly say, for anyone whose questions we couldn't answer today on this webinar and also in person, we have had a little bit of an expert in the background answering people's questions. We will answer those on the blog post, so go and have a look at that at Sustainability Trust. We also have lots of things for sale. The eco shop is open, so we do have bokashi bins and hungry worm farms and all those sorts of things open at the Sustainability Trust eco shop, so feel free to get your zing if you can't make it yourself. And yeah, there's one more webinar left in this series, which is how to grow in your neighborhood or in your community. And there was a question about what can I not take to my community composting. So maybe we can answer that one then. But thank you so much to all of my panelists today, Prashanti, Jess and Kate. Really appreciate your time, and to all the attendees today, thanks for taking the time to come and find out all about how to compost at home. Ka kite.
Ka kite.
Into the rest. All right, post-webinar questions. Can I put cooked food scraps into the compost that I take to my local bin? I'm assuming they're talking about things like innermost gardens, which have compost, and I think they have some rules around that, as I'm sure all of the different compost collective bins do. So, yeah, Kate, you'd probably be a good one to start.
With that community. Oh, sorry.
Go, Kate.
Sorry. Yeah, I'd check with your local community compost that you're taking it to, because everyone does have their own way they like to do it. I wouldn't want to recommend, like at KaiCycle we have certain things that we ask people not to put in, but it might be different for others. So just check in with them. I'm sure they'd be happy to advise you. Right. But like, for example, we accept cooked food scraps, no problem. We just ask people to not put in meat or too much dairy or raw eggs.
Great. And this was actually answered at the very beginning, but let's answer it again. What are the absolute no-nos in terms of food waste that should not go into the compost? One of the things I always get asked is about pasta as well.
Oh, pasta?
Cooked pasta. We often get asked that in our rat-proof composting workshops.
I mean, anything that will break down can go in the compost. Like I did have one person who, he put in something really, like he put in plastic wrapping. And I said, oh, you can't do that. Like, I can't. And he's like, oh, so that won't compost. He's like, no, love, that won't compost. So I guess anything that will break down that is organic can go in your compost. And then you just adjust according to size and risk of, I guess, pests getting into the bin. Yeah.
I would just say also think about balance. Don't put too much of one thing in there. And diversity. So I'm fine with cooked foods in my compost bin in my commercial and at home. But one thing that I don't like a lot of is in my commercial composting, our business customers sometimes give us dough slop. And that's really challenging thing to compost, and also raw potatoes as well. What has to happen is those potatoes need to cook before they then start to break down, and same with the dough slop. It also needs to cook into bread before it can then break down. So It's not that you can't put it in, but it just may take a bit longer, and it may need to be mixed with more carbon products to allow that air to circulate around to keep things active in there.
And a question about how to manage flies in the kitchen bin and those pesky, weird, little tiny flying bugs. I know all about those, and I've got a great technique for catching them. Yeah, how do you manage flies in the kitchen? I feel like
I spray Bokashi EM. I spray EM into my bin, even though I'm not theoretically doing an anaerobic Bokashi thing. I've got EM spray in my kitchen that I also spray down my toilet and my kitchen sink, and I spray EM into my kitchen bucket if it's getting too smelly or the flies are in there. I also have a lid on my compost bucket in my kitchen. If there's a fly problem. And the other thing is just to empty it regularly so it's not building up with food in your kitchen.
The more love you give your compost and the more attention you give it, the less stinky and fly it will be to deal with, for sure. In my house, I just have like a layer of browns. I have a sack of browns next to the compost bin, so whenever I put in any fresh stuff, I top it off with a layer of browns, and then I have a coffee sack that I also put on top of that, and that's just awesome. I never get flies. Summer, you'll always get a few flies, but on the whole, it's really good.
And I guess it's those regular visits to the bin helps to reduce any pest issue, flies, rats, anything. Like the more time you spend, we just use little yogurt containers, or not yogurt, ice cream containers. So that means that it's kind of going out like twice a day, and that's constant checking and like poking around, making sure that no one's interested in covering for flies if we need to. So it's kind of a regular trips to the bin, talking to it, making sure everyone's going okay, normal composting things.
Nice. My trick for catching those little, what I like to call fruit flies, is you just fill up an empty beer bottle. We ironically use a Corona bottle with a little bit of apple cider vinegar and a little bit of dishwashing liquid, and they just flock to it and they fall in and they can't get out.
Oh, good idea. Good tip.
It works really well. Like ours is just chock-a-block, and we don't have any more fruit flies flying around the kitchen.
Nice.
Right. All right. I found 2 avocado pips that have shooted in my compost bin. Should I try and grow them outside my bin, or should I bin them? I'm not expecting them to ever fruit, but I thought I could transplant them for shading in another house.
They're beautiful plants. Like if you can see them, they're definitely nice. Yeah, they're not going to fruit, but be a fun growing experiment. Otherwise, just chuck them back in the compost. Avocado stones take ages to break down, even in a hot compost.
Yeah, and they'll just sprout like crazy. They'll just be constantly sprouting. But yeah, I've done a couple, and we just kind of plant them in places that I want some shade, like that person wants to do. They're really pretty. I really like their leaves. Never expecting fruit, but that's okay.
Yeah, avocado trees, they're a bit frost tender, so if you live in a place where it's frosty, then the seedlings can get killed out with the frost. Avocados also really like fertile, free draining soil. So here on Waiheke, we have heavy clay soils, and it's very difficult for us to grow avocados here. Even if it might germinate in your compost bin, it doesn't necessarily mean if you plant it out, you're going to have a happy tree grow out of that. And you might get fruit. If it does turn into a happy tree, you might get fruit if you're patient enough, and you can wait 10 or 15 years.
Awesome. Right, I'm actually, that's the end of the questions, but before we go, I'd love to ask your kind of top tip to get started with composting, or what's your kind of top tip about composting? I'm going to start with you, Kate.
Cool. I think just get excited about the idea of it. I mean, there's a lot of and take it slow. Like, don't get overwhelmed because there's so much to keep in mind all at once. Like you'll just learn more as you go. It's just, as you say, as Prashanti said, like it starts with like streaming your food waste in your kitchen into a bin, and then figuring out a way to deal with it. Just get started somewhere, and then you'll just learn more. And it's rewarding. It's super rewarding when you get your first batch of compost and you get that nice stuff you can put on your plants. And I think, just like congratulate yourself for taking some steps to can I just launch into a little bit about why I think composting is important?
Sure.
Cool, thanks. So composting is such an important part of nutrient cycling. So we take nutrients out of the ground to grow our food, we eat that food, then currently what we're doing is we're sending food to landfill, and that's just kind of locking those nutrients away. and that creates pollution from the landfill. It also means we're having to use synthetic fertilizers to grow our food in the first place, which also creates pollution, degrades soil, waterway pollution. It's not oils. So if you are just taking those steps to compost, you're enabling those natural nutrient cycles to happen. So you're solving 2 pollution problems at once, and you're also helping build food security into our soils. So I think just feel empowered and excited about that, taking those steps to take some action on environmental issues in your backyard.
Awesome, thanks, Kate. Jess, how about a final thought from you about composting?
That was so well said, Kate. Yeah. It does. I think it does get really exciting once you kind of get going. Like, there's nothing more delightful than when you go into your bin and you're starting to see the first worms start to appear because the bin's starting to break down properly, and I think that's amazing. And the smell of finished compost is the best. There's no better smell. I think my tip is to start small and keep it simple. When it gets too complicated or just there's too much to think about, that's when it gets overwhelming. So starting maybe just with a worm bin and kind of getting a hang of that. And then if you're like, I have more space to make a larger bin, then go from there. But often for households, you can't really fill a household compost bin quickly enough to actually get that kind of hotter compost going. So starting small with a worm bin, or joining with others and maybe doing like a small scale community composting where you can actually get enough of those food scraps to make a decent bin and see that compost start to happen. And YouTube is your friend. You can find anything on YouTube. Like, if you're running into problems, there is someone on YouTube who has figured it out and will explain it beautifully. Yeah.
Awesome, great advice. And last but definitely not least, you, Prashanti.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess my advice would just be don't give up. Stay committed to keeping your food waste out of the general waste stream. Know that sending food waste to landfill is a big problem, and be committed to not participating in that. And don't give up. If you think you failed, you really haven't failed. Just be patient, and Mother Nature will keep doing what she does the best, which is turning, that's nutrient cycling, going around and around. And certainly we can help through all the tips and tricks we said today. If we're committed and we don't give up, we'll get there in the end.
Awesome. Yep, let's stop. I think it's 157,389 tonnes of food going into landfill every year. Let's turn that into black gold for our own gardens and community gardens. Wouldn't that be amazing?
Yeah.